Welcome everyone to this webinar on urban and place-based learning. As you can see, we're still getting some participants joining, I think, but to keep things to schedule, we're going to start off shortly. Now, this webinar features leading-edge research that has investigated relationships between place and educational disadvantage, both in Glasgow City Region and in cities in the Global South. Considers the work of 4 projects and investigators, each of whom will make 10-minute presentations. As you will see, the session's recorded and will be uploaded on the web in an accessible format at some point after the session. Details will be provided in the School of Education website. Cameras will be turned off and microphones muted to aid privacy and also for bandwidth reasons. I've put a notice in the chat. Please use the chat facility to introduce yourself to fellow participants, but please do not include personal information such as phone numbers or emails. Please use the Q&A facility to ask questions. These will be collated and responses will be provided in the Q&A session with both presenters and panelists responding. Now, I'd just like to introduce Professor Mike Osborne, who will chair the session.
Well, good morning, everyone, and Happy New Year from the snows of Scotland. Good afternoon, or good morning, or good night, but don't go, depending on where you are in the world. I'm Mike Osborne. I'm Director of Research in the School of Education here at the University of Glasgow. And before I say anything else, let me hand over to my boss, Professor Marjorie McMahon, our head of school here in Glasgow. So over to you, Marjorie.
Thanks, Mike. I'm not sure who's the boss here, Mike. I espouse a model of collaborative and shared leadership. But anyway, I want to say a warm welcome to everybody. It's been such a lovely treat watching everybody join from all parts of the world. People who I know, people who I know because I've read their work or engaged with their research, and colleagues from right around the world. So you're all very welcome to the University of Glasgow and to the School of Education and to this webinar. I'm very excited by this webinar, as I know you will be, but also by the series of webinars that my colleagues have put in place. And I just want to say a thank you right from the start to both our panelists for today, but also to Mike as Director of Research, and to Trevor Gale as the former head of school, and also to Muir, who's coordinated the session today, for bringing together this series to deal with topics and themes that are of considerable importance to us in the School of Education. And the theme for this seminar, this webinar, and the other webinars that we've planned are all grounded in the work and the research that our staff are involved with in the School of Education and collaboratively across the College of Social Sciences and the university. And so this is very much an opportunity for you to both hear about the work that our colleagues are engaged with, but also to raise questions and engage in debate and make suggestions and proposals about how we collaboratively as educators can work together to make a difference. So thank you for coming along, and thank you to our organisers, and a big thank you to your panellists. I very much look forward to hearing from you today. So thank you, and thanks, Mike.
Okay, thank you, Marjorie. Then so welcome then to this first webinar in our series, which you'll know has the title "Celebrating Social Justice in Education," within which we're seeking to interact with education communities around the world around, as Marjorie said, some of the key issues that we've identified. The focus of this webinar is urban and place-based learning. I'll be hearing from representatives of 4 of our major projects in this area. Some of those projects are very local to the city of Glasgow, and others involve cities and neighbourhoods in the global south. Now, our focus on cities reflects issues such as the rapid and accelerating urbanization around the world, the associated challenges of poverty, crime, environmental risks, poor health, and inequitable access to learning. Furthermore, there's a recognition that learning is so important because it's linked to living productive lives and inclusion, which are intimately connected with localized initiatives and joined up policy initiatives that recognize the heterogeneity of cities. Hence, some of what you will hear soon about our place-based initiatives focuses not just on whole cities, but on neighborhoods. Well, we all know that we've had a very difficult 2020, but we hope that this series will open up possibilities for the future. And as Marjorie said, if you're interested in what you hear, get in touch, as we're always open to collaboration. Today, of course, is a special day in other parts of the world. And what could be better than having a partner to the President of the United States, who is a teacher with a doctorate in education. It certainly provides for us some hope that things can change, and also how suitable that it is that this is all happening just a few days before the UNESCO International Day of Education on the 24th of January. So there's much for us to celebrate. With no further ado, let me then pass on to our first speaker, who is my very good friend and colleague, Professor Michele Schweisfurth. Over to you, Michele.
Thanks very much, Mike, and welcome all of you to this webinar. Thank you very much for coming from wherever you've come from. It's great to have you here. I'm here today to talk about the Sustainable Healthy Learning Cities and Neighbourhoods Centre and Project. SHLC is based at the University of Glasgow as a lead institution, but a number of projects, a number of partner projects across a number of cities in the Global South and with partners in the Global South. So I'm education lead, but I have other colleagues in the School of Education who are involved in the project, including Mike himself, who is capacity strengthening lead, and Yulia Nestrova, who is research associate. But we also have partners in Glasgow in urban studies and in health. So the project is partly about education, but it's also about cities and health. It's partly about research, but it's also about capacity strengthening. And the balance there is perhaps slightly different than you would see in other projects. So we're doing interdisciplinary research. We have an international team doing comparative studies of urbanization in 14 different cities. You can see there the list of countries in the Global South. We have both lower income and middle income countries represented. We have countries in Asia and Africa. So it's a truly international, interdisciplinary research project, but it's also very, very much about capacity strengthening. And we run workshops. We have a visiting research fellow scheme and mentoring. There's a small grants fund that has open application process. And we're aiming to create a strong network of urban researchers that specialize particularly in neighborhood analysis of rapidly urbanizing cities. And perhaps this is what's really unique about our project, that we're focusing on the neighborhoods within cities as a really important unit of analysis. So you can see there our cities, and in the countries that are represented, we have typically the capital city plus a second city. So we're doing comparisons within the countries as well as across the countries, which generates a lot of interesting insights into how different types of cities develop and different neighborhoods within that. But I think what's really interesting from an educationist perspective is that this is interdisciplinary research, and collaboration really, really matters. And sustainable cities depend on health, they depend on education, but they also depend on urban planning, and they depend on all of those things working together. So we bring together expertise from a range of different sectors: urban studies and urban planning, architecture, demography, law, education, health, geography, and so on. And the aim is for us all to learn from each other. And that's an aspect of capacity strengthening, but also, again, that research piece, trying to bring all of those lenses to bear on the neighborhood as a unit. So, as an educationist, I'm obviously particularly interested in the education issues, and some of the questions that we're asking is, how do neighborhoods shape educational opportunity, both in schools and beyond? So do people in different neighborhoods have equal opportunities to attend equally good establishments? Probably not. But what shapes that? What is it about different neighborhoods, different policies, different approaches that shapes those opportunities? And then how are spatial inequalities, those differences between different neighborhoods, perpetuated or interrupted by schools or other educational institutions? It's important to remember we're not just looking at schools, we're looking at pre-compulsory and post-compulsory education, we're looking at informal and non-formal education, as well as the formal education sector. And then how is education valued by residents of different neighborhoods, and how do their educational choices reflect this? So we're looking at these different questions by a range of methods, including mapping, including policy review, including a large household survey, currently on hold because of COVID-19. As with so many projects, we're a little bit stalled, but we've been working very productively during this period and hoping that the restrictions will lift soon. And the qualitative research includes focus groups, but some of our projects are also doing some quite creative things with photography, for example, and sort of mind mapping with participants from different neighborhoods. There are our partners. You'll see that we have partners in each of our countries. We even have 2 in South Africa. And we're funded very generously by the UK government's Global Challenges Research Fund via the UKRI. So this is part of a wider UK scheme for developing capacity across the globe to meet some of the big global challenges, and certainly rapid urbanization and some of the inequalities embedded in that is certainly one of the big global challenges. If you're interested in hearing more about SHLC, you can follow us on Twitter or visit our websites or send an email to the SHLC team to hear more. We would love to hear from you. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michele. And I should say that we have a little later in our response panel with us, Dr. Shilpi Roy, one of our partners, from Bangladesh, who will be saying a few more words about this particular project. So now we're moving on to the second of our projects that relates to work that we're doing in the Global South. And it's Muir Houston, Dr. Muir Houston, who is a senior lecturer in education here at the university, who is going to lead that presentation. So over to you, Muir.
So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mike. So I'm going to say a little bit about the SOEA project, Strengthening University Engagement in Universities in Asia and Africa. This was funded as part of the British Academy's Global Challenge Research Fund, but was the result of a seed corn funding by the Scottish Funding Council to set up the network to allow us to bid for the larger funding. And here we can see the badges of our partner universities: University of De Hoek, University of Kurdistan, Philippines Normal University, University of Glasgow, University of Johannesburg, and the University of Zimbabwe. So what was the project about? We were hoping to address a core problem in emerging economies, strengthening the urgent engagement role of universities. And as you see, theoretically, we drew on the various helix models of engagement. And we wanted to find out the ways in which universities contribute to developing sustainable cities in the context of the major social, cultural, environmental and economic challenges facing the Global South. So to do this, we used a set of well-proven benchmarking tools from the Pascal Observatory University and Regional Engagement Project, and sought to strengthen the capacity of universities to contribute to city resilience towards the natural and man-made challenges and address some of these challenges that they faced. So in collaboration and discussion with the partners, we identified a number of common themes relevant across all sites. Now, these included migration, including refugees, internally displaced, and urban and rural flows, particularly important for many of our partners. Environment, including sustainability in terms of energy, food and water and waste, and the impact of natural disasters, flooding, etc. In terms of the economy, we're looking at unemployment with a focus on youth and females. We also looked at the informal economy and skills and training in terms of developing entrepreneurship. In terms of gender, we were particularly interested in inequalities and access to health, welfare, jobs and education. And we also had a rhetorical take on the reality or the rhetoric of university and city engagement strategies. So did the mission statement actually match the reality on the ground? So in terms of city activities, in each city, a stakeholder advisory group was set up, comprising representatives from universities and city or municipal government. Benchmarking and interviews undertaken to examine the scope and scale of university engagement, and also to allow city representatives to identify possible areas of collaboration to address specific challenges in areas such as transport systems, waste, sustainable energy and economic development. Also mapped a kind of supply and demand and identification of this latent demand that was maybe not being taken up at the time. In terms of our promotion, in terms of we're a website, where you can find the thematic papers, city profiles for each site, 18 case studies of university engagement were undertaken, and a number of academic journal articles were produced. In terms of outcomes and kind of effects, or after the project had closed, a number of collaborations continued, and a number of our partners are involved in other projects with colleagues here at the University of Glasgow and the College of Social Sciences and beyond. Example, in a research collaboration between the University of The Hawk and the city's landmine department, looking at the environmental impact of conflict and landmine clearance in the area, and also brought about by the huge influx of refugees and displaced persons during some of the conflicts in the Middle East region. We also had the renewal of a memorandum of agreement that embraces all the faculties at the University of Zimbabwe and all the departments at the city of Harare, and that's us actually outside the town hall in Harare, the background to this picture, where we were meeting with the town clerk, who is the equivalent of the mayoral, chief executive of a council. There was also an establishment of a memorandum of agreement concerning community engagement between Philippines Normal University and 7 barangays, which are the smallest political unit in the Philippines, and with the collaboration of 3 NGOs. We've also been very successful in funding for the Erasmus Plus international mobility, with development of PhD students and staff in education, engineering and medicine in Iraq and Zimbabwe, and this runs between 2018 and 2023. Of course, we have had some impact on this with the COVID, a number of visits we had with PhD students and lecturing staff. We were almost at the point of booking flights, I believe, when the pandemic hit. So we're hoping still to get that up and running, but in the current circumstances, we're unsure how that will happen. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Muir. And I should say that we also have with us in the response panel today one of our collaborators in that project, Professor Charles Drever from the University of Zimbabwe, who we will be talking to a little later on. So we're going to move very rapidly north now and back to Glasgow. And I'm going to hand over to Dr. Alison Drever from Children's Neighbourhoods Scotland. We'll be talking about some of the things that we're doing locally here in Glasgow. So over to you, Alison.
Thanks, Mike, and hello, everyone. So I think this may be one end of the scale to the other, and talking about Children's Neighbourhoods Scotland, based on Michele and Muir's presentations. I'm going to be talking about Children's Neighbourhoods Scotland today. Sarah Ward is one of our research associates. Contact details are all on here. Sarah I actually see is in the attendees because she's actually at the ARC Accelerator Programme Bootcamp today. So she's very happy to pick up any questions, because I will talk at quite a high level about the work and the research that's going on in the programme. So a little bit about the programme first of all. So it's a partnership between the University of Glasgow and the Glasgow Centre for Population Health. The biggest pot of funding for this programme comes from the Scottish Government via Every Child, Every Chance, which is actually not funded through education, it's funded through the Social Justice Unit. So there's some interesting connections into education there. We also have other funders from the public and private sector, including health and social care, local authority as well. Obviously, we work in areas where there are high levels of poverty. We have 6 neighbourhood sites. We have 4 that are in urban areas, but in addition to that, 1 small town and 1 rural. And that's something the Scottish Government are very interested in, is looking at a place-based model that can work in different contexts and how that looks. The work and the research that we do has 2 main aims that you can see up there on the screen. And one of the things that actually makes this programme unique, so I have as yet been unable to find another example, is a place-based programme of this nature that works out of a university. I think often the model is that the programme works and the university is brought in as a partner, but we have both working together. So in the team, we have a team of researchers, but we also have a team of local coordinators who are based out in our sites. And they have a large variety of backgrounds, from youth work, community development, a retired policeman, arts backgrounds. So we do have quite a varied team within there. The research, there's a pre and post COVID story, as there is in most things at the moment. So our research is structured under 4 different themes, and I'm not talking about all of those today. You can see them in the blue arrows. I am going to talk a bit about the capabilities research with children and young people, which is Sarah Ward's focus that she leads on. And I'm going to talk a little bit about our COVID research as well, from a very local perspective. So the capabilities research that Sarah has been working on, the UNRC, I'm assuming everyone's familiar with that, but actually our early data from people in the sites we were working in told us that children's voices were not heard in the decisions that were made about them. And you can see a couple of quotes up there on the screen. I know the Children's Commissioner in Scotland has said that children's voices have not been heard enough over the COVID period as well. So the framework that Sarah has focused on developing is absolutely all of those things that are on the table. Now, the research model itself is published on our website, and the website address is on the final slide. Please go in and have a look at it if you're interested. So Sarah and our team work with children and young people. We've, I think, started as young as 7 and up to sort of mid-teens at the moment, but we'll probably expand that. We've worked with children with additional support needs, primary sector, secondary sector, and so on. The model itself, I describe as the person that has to go out and, you know, talk to people in sites a lot about the work that's going on, is a unifying framework. Capabilities, I've been really surprised at the buy-in that we've had for this as an approach to looking at well-being from a multi-dimensional perspective. So, and I'll talk a little bit about the impact of that on the final slide. I'm going to say a little bit about our COVID research. So, like everyone else, we had everything planned. We worked very closely with partners in our sites. And when the pandemic hit, we talked to the partners in our sites who are public and third sector at a neighbourhood level. And we said, what can we do that would help here? And the one thing that we were asked to do is capture what's happening, capture what this looks like at a neighbourhood level that helps us to share that. So in the first 2 weeks of the pandemic, we changed course and we developed a piece of qualitative research that focused on frontline and service responses in our sites. And we have 3 large reports, but also a whole series of briefing and insight papers that have come from that. So the capabilities research with that focus on children and young people alongside our COVID research is helping in a number of different parts of the system. So the publications are at the top, and I'm not going to talk about those. They're all on our website if anyone wants to hear more about that. And we're very willing to pick up on any of this after today as well. At a neighbourhood level, the capabilities research, those frameworks that are produced by the young people, and we work with the young people as co-researchers to help them conduct their own research and contribute to this. So the framework is theirs as well. And that is really helping to inform decision making. So on one of our sites, as an example, in Scotland, we have a children and young people's mental health task force with a set of recommendations, and our young researchers in the secondary school, who were very experienced at having a voice within the school. Mental health came through really strongly in their research within the capabilities framework. And those young people are now working with a whole variety of partners at a community planning level across the area. They've got very, very practical ideas for how their mental health could be better supported, not just in their school through education, but also as a peer group and with the community. So that capabilities research has led to a point where those young people are now getting involved at a district or local authority in Scotland level to really look at how their mental health is better supported. At a policy level, our research is working in a number of different ways. So we're working with Scottish Government, who particularly around the communities aspect of this, are really interested in how children become more involved in policy making, and capabilities, as I said, they see as a very unifying framework to do that. So we're talking to a number of colleagues in there about how we can get children and young people more involved in that. At a local policy level, the research that we've been doing in Glasgow particularly has been feeding into the Poverty Leadership Panel and their Social Recovery Task Force. So the nature of that research that we did over COVID, because it's very focused on local responses at a neighbourhood level, so it's informing the recovery planning in that way. And at a national level, although we are not technically an education project, when you work with children and young people, education obviously is a large part of that. So the Children's Neighbourhoods research has fed into policy in relation to education and communities in a number of ways, and I've listed some of those on the slide there for you to see. So for us as a programme, the research, one of the biggest things for me is the research that we are doing is impacting and making a difference in as many different parts of the system as we can. So obviously at a neighbourhood level, I know Michele, you spoke about, you know, that neighbourhood as a unit of analysis. So absolutely, the research that we are doing must impact at that neighbourhood level, but equally it has to inform at a national policy level. So when we're talking to our partners in our neighbourhoods at the moment, and they're saying, we know what it's like in our neighbourhoods, but we need policymakers to better understand that. So our research can hopefully help to make those connections as well. And for us, there's next step is a reframing of the research in the programme to take account of the COVID context and what that's going to mean for our research and for the neighbourhoods and partners that we work with across our 6 sites for the coming year and beyond. And the final slide has contact details on it and our website. We have lots of, well, everything's published on our website. So if you do have an interest, please have a look, and you are very welcome to get in touch with me or Sarah. I don't know if Sarah's still part of the attendees, but yeah, please get in touch. We're very happy to talk to people more about any of the work that we are doing. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Alison. And let me say that all of the slides that you've seen today will be made available later on our website, together with the recording of today's session. So if you think you haven't picked some things up that have been talked about during the course of the webinar, we will provide that information. So we're now going to move on to the final project that we're showcasing today, and that's the work of the Urban Big Data Centre. So first of all, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Phil Mason, who is a research fellow in UBDC, and he will begin the presentation, and at some point I think hand over to Professor Catherine Lido.
Okay, thanks very much, Mike. Hang on, I'm in trouble.
I've shared the screen, Phil, so you should.
Oh, okay, right, thank you. Right, I'm just trying to do that myself. Okay, so our project is called the Educational Disadvantage and Place Project, and it's a way of looking at big and novel data to meet social challenges, as you can see there. So we work in UBDC, which overlaps with the School of Education. So the UBDC was set up in 2014. It's currently jointly funded by the ESRC and the University of Glasgow. So what our function as a centre, research centre, is to promote the use of big data allied with novel research methods, which are always developing, with a view to improving social, economic and environmental well-being in the urban context. So we're producing, as a whole, we're producing analyses of the impact on public policy, society. We have, in the UBDC actually has several strands. We look at housing and neighbourhoods, transport and infrastructure, urban governance, urban sensing and analytics, and something I wanted to highlight was the flexibility of our abilities to come up with fairly rapid responses to contemporary issues. So we're doing quite a lot of work on COVID-19 impacts in the urban setting. But obviously what we're concerned with here today is the education and skills strand of the work in UBDC. So this strand, this work package, consists of 4 areas really, going through the entire educational journey from secondary education through further higher education into employment. In secondary education, we're primarily looking at place-based inequalities in secondary school attainment and progression. Scotland has a terrible and well-known attainment gap, which can be related to deprivation, amongst other things. And we're looking at ways in great detail to see where the drivers of that lie. Moving into further education, there are questions about whether further education in Scotland is fulfilling its purpose. Are people undertaking further education and going into useful work at the end? And similarly in higher education, we're looking at learner success in access, attainment and their entry into skilled employment as well. Finally, a rather more overarching aspect is the inclusive learning cities. So we have a team of, I think, it looks like there are 7 of us, yeah. So led by Catherine Lido, formerly by Mike Osborne. Keith Kintray is leading on the schools. And we have Muir Houston, who's leading on further education. Catherine, as I say, is leading on higher education. And Mike leads on the learning cities. We have 2 very excellent students, Barry Black and Brittany Nathaniel, who are doing great things. And on this one, I think I hand over to Catherine.
Thanks, Phil. And just to point out on Phil's lovely visual here, that you can see a lot of emphasis on transitions. So our goal is not just to collect administrative data, but to link it to each other and to novel forms of data, like Phil's enabled some data linkage to green space, which we used to look at the impact of green space on adult and less formal types of learning in Glasgow. So all of this happens within a framework which Mike is so kindly introduced to the work package, which has just been phenomenal. We work from the UNESCO Learning Cities framework, and if you're not familiar with it, you can just Google the Beijing 42 Indicators of a Learning Cities document, which is available as a PDF. And you can see this lovely visual here, which basically says that you can have you need these fundamentals for lifelong learning for all. And it's about mobilizing resources, having the governance and participation of all stakeholders, and the political will and commitment to make lifelong learning for all a reality. And then at the top, you can see the outcomes that you're hoping for in a learning city: empowerment, social cohesion, economic and cultural prosperity, and sustainable development. So you can see how learning cities is similar to smart cities, future cities, but embeds learning at the heart of how you achieve these lofty outcomes. And the columns are some of the things that can be operationalized and actually measured, which we've tried to do in a piece of work that that was the first open data product from Urban Big Data Center. And I'll put the link in the chat box if you wish to access this data. It's completely open, at least some of it is. You just literally need to fill in a brief online application, and you can have a look at the Integrated Multimedia City Data Project survey data, for instance, with 1,500 householders, and the travel diary is pretty easy to access and use. But this was supplemented by about 600 GPS trackers, people wearing GPS around the city for a week, and life logging camera images that they took around the city for 48 hours. And behind this, there's a Twitter data dashboard that you can search, which is 1 year's worth of social media data capture, starting around the Commonwealth Games up through the first independence referendum for a year. So all of this is open data that you can access and play with. In covers attitudes, literacies, and behaviors in various domains, including education and skills. So very briefly, I know we don't have a huge amount of time. I certainly have no time to go into the ethics behind doing this or the data curation, but I can just show you one thing, one potential outcome use of the data. We've had a few academic papers published looking at things like older adult learning marginalization and the link between physical mobility and adult learning engagement. But in order to move beyond the papers, we worked with Creative Sterling, and you can see pictured here at the bottom of our screen, Joe Hall, who's the director of Creative Sterling, Kate Reed, my colleague in the School of Education, and here we are at IKEA, where we took some of the survey data on inequalities in what we call life-wide literacies. So health literacy, environmental literacy, and financial literacy in particular. And we visualized the inequalities around the greater Glasgow area by local authority. But more importantly, we turned it into an interactive quiz. You can see there was quiz boards behind them. And if you get the literacy right, you got one of these, see the dinosaur in the top of your screen, you got a badge. And so you could put together your own life-wide literacy animal creature that represents all the skills that make you successful and good and successful in life. And so while we were doing that with the children, we were able to have a conversation with the parents about Urban Big Data Center, about social science, about life-wide literacies. So this is just one impact of our impact and outreach work. And I realized that we're running short on time. I just wanted to hand back to Phil to talk about other implications that our data is having in blogs and in news media coverage presently. And that will be the end of our talk. So just one more minute for Phil to pass back to Phil. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Catherine. Yeah, so I just wanted to point out this is one example of the way that we are able to respond relatively rapidly to hot issues. This particular one here, many of you attending from the UK, I'm sure will recall last summer's school exam controversy, which happened first in Scotland, yes, but then happened in England as well. So in March, the Scottish secondary school exams were cancelled due to the COVID-19. And the Scottish Qualifications Agency was charged with developing an alternative certification model, which was based on teachers' estimates of their pupils' exam results, but moderated by an algorithm which took into account the historical previous year's attainment at the school level. What this resulted in was downgrading of teachers' estimates, which is, this was to replicate general patterns. But as predicted by many people, this downgrading was worse for pupils from higher deprivation areas, thereby reflecting these baked-in inequalities in educational attainment. So, for example, for the higher certificates, 15% of grades were downgraded to fails in the most deprived quintile, compared with 7% in the least deprived. As a result of the controversy that arose from this, that model was scrapped. So our PhD student, Barry Black, who's very hot on this, he requested under the Freedom of Information Act to get some data about free school meals, which is actually a better, perhaps a better measure of deprivation at the individual pupil level. And we replicated these analyses. And he found that with schools where there are more than 40% of pupils on free school meals, 20% of those people in their hires had their grades downgraded from a pass to a fail. And that was twice as many as in schools where there were fewer than 10% of pupils on free school meals. So it's showing here that the alternative certification model reflects these systematic inequalities in attainment, and rather steamrollers the efforts and attainment of individual pupils. So this is a piece that he published as a blog. You can see just at the bottom there, there's a link to that. And it's work that we're pursuing in greater detail at the individual school level, looking at free school meals and other aspects of deprivation, which we hope to publish in the longer term as an academic article.
So if I can just jump back in and say, this is just one example of how Urban Big Data Center has opened up use of data and allowed us to be a bit more responsive and flexible. And Barry's work obviously led to not just media coverage, but also a parliamentary training event. He was invited to give a keynote. So this is just a few examples of our work, but please go to our website so you can keep up to date with our blogs, with our academic publications, and also our impactful outreach work, which we continue to do during COVID via webinars, training, etc. Sorry to cut you off, Phil. Any last words?
No, that's fine. I was hoping you were going to round things off so nicely. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Phil and Catherine. I think you've given a very good account there of some work which is very different, very much data-driven, and complements some of the other work that we've heard about. I'm now going to just pass over to two of the people that we've been collaborating with in the Global South. I've mentioned both before, so and I'm going to pose the same question. I'm going to ask Charles first to just say something. This is Professor Charles Nerera from the University of Zimbabwe. I'm going to ask Charles to sort of comment on what he's heard generally, and to say a little bit about the benefits of being involved in the research where he was a collaborator.
Thank you very much, Mike, and hello, everybody. Right. Now, the work we did with Mike, in fact, I would say it's ongoing, because the way it started is that we've got a permanent collaboration. it opened up, I think, collaborations between 6 countries. And one of the biggest advantages was to compare notes when we traveled, for instance, to the Philippines and to see what is happening there. We've been to Glasgow to learn what is happening there, and experiences from Tanzania, from the workshops we've had, South Africa, Iraq, Iran. Now, I think the biggest advantage was that collaboration, which is actually now leading into constant conversations, even beyond the kind of research we engaged under the SWER, the urban engagement. Now, with our city of Harare, it left lasting landmarks in the sense that although we are in the same city, University of Zimbabwe, and the city of Harare personnel, but after this, they realized that actually we're closer than what we should be. And it came out after this the research which we carried out and the workshop which we held in Harare. So it has opened up a lot of openings for us to collaborate, as Mike indicated at the beginning, and Muir. The faculties at the University of Zimbabwe, especially now under the COVID lockdown, there's a lot of collaboration going on, for instance, in the preparation of sanitizers, other protective equipment, and tackling the issues surrounding COVID and the education of children. So we really appreciated, I think, from this project that it opened up internationally and locally, and even within the University of Zimbabwe, that we talk about how to work with communities from a similar viewpoint. Thank you very much, Mike, and thank you very much, everybody. And I enjoyed listening to the presentations. Very enlightening. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. And so I'm going to just pose the same question now to Shilpi. SHLC has been is still at a midpoint almost because of the extensions that we're working on. But I wonder if you might have any comments, Shilpi, about the benefits of being involved in the SHLC project, and particularly from the perspective of education, although you may wish to talk about other things as well. You're muted, Shilpi.
Yeah. I would like to thank Phil, Catherine, Alison, Muir, and Michele for their presentation and introducing the work they're doing. Especially Michele is, we are working together in HSLC. So this consortium is quite a big consortium because we got the chance to work on 12 other cities in Asia and Africa. And also education as a theme, it was quite neglected area in urban research in Bangladesh. So through this research, we got a chance to explore the umbrella of education policies, its governance mechanisms, and how cities and neighborhoods, those are creating some sort of opportunities so that education attainment is actually met. Although Bangladesh has done quite well in Millennium Development Goal, but there were issues. In a minute, I'm going to share that. So over the last 3 years, we have done quite an impressive work, I would say, because we have gathered data on different aspects of education. So for our work, especially related to education and its relation with neighborhood sustainability, we have conceptualized that a sustainable neighborhood can offer some of the fundamental qualities. Those have implications on access to inclusive education facilities and education attainment. For example, sustainable neighborhoods are well designed and built. Those are active and inclusive, well connected, well served, and all these 4 principles actually create some of the qualities. For example, a well-designed and built neighborhood are well planned. All the land uses are planned in a way so that education functions can actually conform with the other functions, adjacent function. At the same time, in these neighborhoods, public transports are integrated, designed in an integrated way with the educational facilities. Walkways and cycling pathways are safe. Street networks are vibrant. At the same time, the fundamental one is the distribution of educational facilities and their types. For example, in these neighborhoods, there should be enough number of education and lifelong learning opportunities, and they should be designed in a way so that people can access from different corners of neighborhoods or even conserve the adjacent neighborhoods. At the same time, the educational institutions should offer social mix, equality of access to education, at the same time, recreational facilities within the schools and adjacent to schools. So if we, and through our research, what we have found that the literacy rate in Dhaka, it's the capital and it's a mega city, it's higher than the national average, it's about 70%. But in other city, we have another case study city that is Khulna. In Khulna, the rate is quite low, it's about only 41%. So you can see the literacy rate is half of Dhaka. But this picture is not uniform throughout the city. In the poor neighborhoods, this rate is, sorry, in Khulna it's almost same as Dhaka, but in terms of the literacy in low-income neighborhoods, it's quite low. We found the rate is only 41% in low-income neighborhoods. And especially the access to higher education is very poor in low-income neighborhood. So what went wrong? Our study suggests that in Dhaka, we found that due to limited investments in public schools, private schools have mushroomed in Dhaka over the last 30 years. The figure is quite alarming. We found in one lower middle income neighborhood that out of 100 schools, only 2 schools are actually public schools and 92 schools are private schools, and cost of schooling is quite high in those schools. Also in terms of the facilities, low-income neighborhoods, that means the slums, urban villages, in those neighborhoods, there are shortages of quality schools. For example, in the largest slum, there are concentration of NGOs, but their schools are like temporary. For example, for 6 months, they built a school in some place and they move to other place and they are offering multi-layer schooling system. They struggle a lot to keep the students. So dropout rate is quite higher, but there are very little public sector investments in those neighborhoods. In terms of the distribution, we found that there are contradictions in setting standards, and especially the decisions of making schools are not actually bottom up, it's kind of top down, and government is actually playing an insignificant role, I would say, because we found that in high income neighborhoods that there are the student and the institution rate is quite high, whereas for example in the poor neighborhoods there are less than 1 schools per 1,000 people. So primary schools and higher schools, those are distributed disproportionately without considering the population density of the neighborhoods. So neighborhood planning, so out of these findings, our preliminary observation is that neighborhood planning should have greater emphasis on education. Design of neighborhoods should think about the income type of those neighborhoods is built from and how the facilities are distributed. What about its roads? What about the quality roads? What is traffic calming measures and so on? So Mike, that's all from me.
Thank you, Shilpi. That was a very good account of what you're doing. And I was also thinking that in terms of benefits, the fact that your cities are now involved with UNESCO International Institute for Educational Planning in looking at the role of education in urban planning and policy development has been a considerable bonus as well in relation to that work. Well, thank you very much to Charles and Shilpi for those reflections. We're now going on to a series of questions which have been posed by delegates to panelists, and there are a considerable number, and I hope that I can get through all of them in the time that we have available, and I'll try very hard. So I ask the panelists that when they respond to respond relatively briefly. So the first question is a very general one, and I think we've heard something of a response in relation to this question already. The question is, in each project, what is the most important thing that you've learned to date, and has anything surprised you? So I don't know if you've seen the question in the chat box. If you have, you've prepared yourself. If you haven't, the first person that I asked to answer is the unlucky one. So it'll be a random choice, and I'm going to go to Catherine first of all, and to respond to that question. So just if you could respond to those two questions very, very quickly.
Sorry, Mike, could you repeat them? I was trying to get our colleague in on the link, but
okay.
I haven't been able
So
to.
so what do you think is the most important thing you've learned to date in the UBDC work, and has anything surprised you?
Great question. The first thing I've learned is to blur this distinction between qualitative and quantitative evaluation, because it gets, the more we open our minds to thinking of different ways of approaching subjects, working across disciplines, working across stakeholders, it becomes a little less meaningful. And what becomes more important is trying to learn to speak the languages of different disciplines and realize that we're often asking the same research questions, the same, so trying to meet the same social challenges, but we're just asking with different terminology, and we're trying to assess it with different methodology. So yeah, learning to get more comfortable speaking in different academic languages, but also non-academic. It's been really great working with Creative Sterling and MacLab and all the social enterprises we work with, Food Train, really learning to speak their languages, the language of the communities that they're serving. It's been really interesting. Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but that's been my experience.
Okay, Phil, do you want to add anything to that? Maybe you can answer the question. Has anything surprised you?
The thing that surprised me is the enormous potential of in our case, of big data. It's in a sense, it's only limited by our imaginations and legislation, but also with that extra scale come additional difficulties and challenges. As I say, so there are difficulties of linking data sets, technical ones and legislational ones. But it's very much, I think I expected when I first started looking at big data, it was all going to be there. And we're all still very much exploring how to do it. So it's very much the whole big data enterprise, not just the educational work, but everything else is all one big work in progress. And it's, even in the short time I've been doing it, it's advanced enormously. Where I was, say, three years or so ago when I first started at UBDC, things have moved on enormously since then, and it's very exciting, and it's difficult to keep up with it sometimes.
Thanks, Phil. I'm moving backwards, so I'm going to come to Children's Neighbourhoods Scotland, and either Alison or Sarah, who's joined us now, could answer. So, what have you learned from your work that's most important, and what surprised you?
This one.
Shall I?
Sarah, do you want to kick off then?
Great. Hello. Sorry for not being able to join you earlier. I've been on another training program. I think probably the most important for me is that young people are very motivated to make change. So young people in high poverty neighbourhoods have loads of ideas and loads of depth in understanding of the issues. But the real barriers to young people's voices being heard are to do with institutional power sharing and institutions not knowing how to open up those spaces to young people's voices. So that's been really important for us to think about, how do we begin to try and broker those spaces in ways that young people want to engage. In terms of surprising, the thing that constantly surprises me, which I've just referred to actually, is how nuanced the thinking is amongst even quite young children around issues of poverty and well-being. So children with additional support needs as young as 10 were able to tell us quite a lot about what they need in terms of standard of living, the kinds of human relationships they want, the kinds of family relationships they want, what support they need in their community, and also had a lot of understanding of sort of community support systems like housing associations and what they do for families. And also, I mean, this kind of answers one of the other questions, which is also a lot of in-depth understanding of concerns around the climate crisis and what can be done about that. And they raised issues like their concerns around the instability of global leadership. I mean, honestly, this was a group of 10-year-olds that raised this issue. So for me, what's constantly surprising is how much experience and understanding children have to bring. It's not just about, oh, wouldn't it be nice to consult with children? It's actually, no, they do have some really great answers and ideas for us. So I think it's really important that we encourage policymakers to really listen.
Thanks, Sarah. I will move on to another project now, and I'll pose something else to Alison later. So on to the Suyua project. And since we have Charles here, I think I'll give Charles the opportunity first to say something about what do you think the most important thing is that you've learned in Zimbabwe from the work that you've been doing with us? You're muted, Charles.
Okay, thank you very much. I think the greatest lesson I've learned, I think, is to do with the importance of interdisciplinary research, because the team of the SOYA team, we are all from different academic backgrounds. And we also added during our research with the non-academic people from the cities themselves, and how to talk about research and get results that are inclusive of all those viewpoints, and not just from academics, but from non-academics across countries and across cultures. I think that's the biggest, but the importance of interdisciplinary research has occurred to us that simple questions are not as simple if you approach them from a single discipline. You need answers from all disciplines, as architects, engineers, medical people, sociologists, and the other citizens from various backgrounds. Thank you.
Thank you. Muir, would you like to add something yourself?
Suppose it was just the importance of the collaborations and the networks that you develop, sort of thing. I mean, one of the important things was that we were not strangers when we started this project. Mike and I had personal connections with many of the partners, and I think that made a huge difference in terms of the strength of the collaboration. But a point I'd like to make is, I think it's very important that, I mean, we mentioned that our 5 themes were developed out of out of what our partners wanted. I think it's very important that when you're writing these bids, it's not your bid really. It shouldn't be your research. It should be research that they need in the Global South. And I think that's very important, that the voices from the Global South and the design and the implementation stage are really looked, included, sort of thing. So I think, I mean, that's very important, that, it's this idea that, it sometimes feels as if we're doing research on the Global South rather than partnership and a true collaboration, and assisting and facilitating and maybe helping our partners in the Global South to achieve their aims and objectives rather than our aims and objectives. So thanks.
Thanks, Muir. That's a very neat segue, I think, to asking Shilpi to respond on this question, particularly given that my job is capacity strengthening amongst our colleagues in the SHLC. I should say one of my jobs. Many hats are worn.
Should I jump in?
Please do.
I think I have learned 2 aspects. The first one is planning for education facilities it's a quite neglected area, and there is a huge scope to work on that area. but right at the moment, all the researches, for example, there are not much researches on that area. Before HSLC's work, we got only one publication on that topic. So you can imagine the scarcity of researches in that area. So there is a scope we can work there. Secondly, there are researches in other areas, but policymakers, they don't go through the research findings. They don't go through books. So it is important that we reach to the policymakers. We share what we have got and we make them aware that these areas are quite important area for creating learning city. So, and at the same time, people, children's parents, children's students, they are not actually incapacitated to give their voice in decision makings. So if we can, through this research or any other research, can engage them, then that might play a role for capacity building. At the same time, there are poor neighborhoods. In those neighborhoods, public sector investments are quite low. NGOs are only working in big slums, but there are many, about more than 3,000 pockets of slums, small slums, and NGOs are not working there. So they have some sort of projects, but those are not frequent. So through different projects, even the research projects should include some designed impact activities on those neighborhoods. So that is the two key important things I have learned working in HSLC.
Thank you, Shilpi. So Michele, you've had a long time to think now. So
thank goodness for that. Yeah, I think one thing that I've learned, we've learned, is that there are so many ways to think about a neighborhood, right? What do we mean by a neighborhood? So, you know, we've obviously sometimes neighborhoods have administrative functions and boundaries. Sometimes you can tell spatially when one neighborhood ends and another begins because the type of housing changes. But there's a whole set of things about, you know, the neighborhood in the mind and where people believe their neighborhoods begin and end, how they themselves see the edges of their worlds. And we have a couple of excellent PhD students in the School of Education, Rona Brown and Priti Dagar. And Rona, I know, is doing work with children and kind of doing walk-alongs with them and sort of hearing where they see the, you know, the functions of their neighborhood and where it begins and ends. So, and we've also got colleagues in South Africa who've been using machine learning to develop maps of neighborhoods which are based on shared characteristics, which have nothing to do with any of those administrative boundaries or existing maps. So there's really interesting stuff around what we actually mean by a neighborhood. In terms of surprise, I mean, one little fact and a very, very personal reaction. One fact which came out of South Africa, you know, when you visit these informal settlements where people are living in extreme poverty, and you are aware that many of these people have migrated to the cities from rural areas where they may have been very poor, but they may have perhaps had easier access to food and more space and so on. You see how they live in informal settlements. You think that this was a good move? And I've been always asked a lot of questions about that. But actually the evidence out of South Africa is that for people who move from the rural areas to the cities, the education outcomes and then the employability and financial outcomes that flow from those actually are pretty good on the whole. And so it's interesting, we think of neighborhoods as, we think of cities as challenges, we think of rural to urban migration as a big challenge, but when you look at the facts, certainly in some places, we need to test it in others, but in some places, you can see why. Because cities do offer opportunities to people, even people who are living in some of the poorest areas. And I guess my own little personal surprise, and maybe I shouldn't have been surprised. I used to visit these sorts of places a lot more, but I haven't so much in recent years. The absolutely extraordinary welcome that we get when we come to the very poorest of the poor neighborhoods, and the interesting contrast with some of the other neighborhoods that we visit.
Thanks, Michele. So that was only one, or one question or a question with two components, and that's taken a lot of time, but we've had some very valuable answers. I'm going to be a bit more focused as we move towards the end of this and pose questions to specific people. So I've got a question for you, Alison. You mentioned that one project location that you worked in was a rural location. So the question is essentially, how do you determine what constitutes rurality or a rural location?
It's a great question, and I don't think there's a straightforward answer to it. So we used a variety of data sources, as you would expect, around that. We probably particularly the quantitative data that's there around this in Scotland. However, as programme director, one of my first jobs was to establish from funders whether they had particular definitions of what they were looking for in terms of a rural neighbourhood, and they didn't, which I thought was really interesting. So it actually fell to us working with our partner funders to make that decision and define what that was. So I, working with my research team, generated a list of criteria that were quite broad, is what I'm going to say. And we actually used that as the basis for discussion with partners in different places and different possible rural locations. And we used that alongside the data that we had available to us. And that the quantitative data came both from national sources, but also from district or level local authority sources as well. And actually it was a combination of those things. Because we knew we needed a certain percentage, you know, for child poverty was one of our criteria and so on. But actually, the two that really helped us were around buy-in and authorising environments from a rural perspective, because it's all very well to sit in a room with a chief executive of a local authority and have the discussion about where these places should be that we would work, and it's really important to do that. But equally important is that you go to the place and have the discussions there about whether this is the right thing to do and whether there is a need for it. And actually my experience of setting up the urban, small town and rural sites, that was a very different experience in the rural community to how it looked in an urban community. And I could talk a lot about that, but I'm not going to because time is tight. But I think my answer to that is there is not an answer to that question. One answer from my perspective, it was a variety of things. I hope that helps a little bit.
It certainly does. It's not surprising that we're getting some questions that relate to the pandemic. So we have a question about how institutions' academic and research values have changed as a result of the pandemic, and a more specific question that from Kenny Anderson that relates to what Catherine was talking about the pillars of building blocks, but he asks if panelists might want to reflect on the resilience of the cultures of learning and the good practice that have been rising from the challenges caused by COVID. So I'm not going to ask all of you to respond there, but Catherine, would you like to say something first of all about issues that have arisen as a result of COVID and good practices and practices that we've had to change as a result of that?
Sure. I mean, it's an excellent question. And let me also just say that I agree with what Alison was saying, and Shipley as well, as about telling nice stories for policymakers and being able to triangulate different types of evidence and bring them together to provide the statistics and hear the voices of the community together makes a really powerful story for change. So I just wanted to say that I agreed with what both of you had shared and what everybody has shared as well, and Charles as well. And everybody's talking about meeting the challenges of COVID. And from a learning cities point of view, we've had, as you know, Mike, this webinar series on trying to meet the challenges of COVID-19 and how, you know, academics, community groups, and so on can work together. And I think there's so many more blogs out there that are worth watching, and webinars as well, with suggestions for really how learning cities can help in the recovery, because learning is moving online more rapidly and learning is moving to less formal settings more rapidly. And I think we need to see this as an opportunity to exchange knowledge and to really make sure that people are included now more than ever, because there is the real risk of widening inequalities due to digital infrastructure. And Lavinia Hirsu, my colleague, and I wrote a paper identifying 4 vulnerabilities to digital inclusion and participation in a Learning Cities framework. So it hasn't been published. The paper hasn't been published. It was written pre-COVID, but we wrote a nice blog on Urban Big Data Center. So pop along there. But that's what I would say. I would say that the real issue now is tackling digital inequality so that we don't widen the gap, that we actually take it as an opportunity to rethink how learning can be more and not less inclusive.
Thanks, Catherine. And in response to the question, the general question about institutional cultures and so on that was posed by Leanne Guerra, I don't think we can go into that in huge detail today, but it's sufficient to say that we've had to make very, very significant changes in terms of the ways in which we're approaching research during this period. A nice segue now, and a question to Michele from our colleague Konstantinos Pagritas at UNESCO in Hamburg, who we've been working with in a previous webinar series, relates to youth, and it relates to mental health issues. And mental health has been something which has come up earlier today in relation to children in our discussion, and the Children's Neighbourhood Scotland talked about that. Indeed, quite interestingly, in a meeting that I was involved a couple of days ago, another discussion, we were talking about the mental health of adults as well, and the role of adult learning in that context. And it would have been a question that I might have posed, you know, are we giving enough attention to that? But the question to Michele is, have you encountered any effective interventions that are in place at local level that are focusing on youth and improving their mental health and well-being in the context of COVID? And we can hand over to Charles and Shilpi if they would like to add to that. But Michele.
I can't really think of any specific initiatives that we've come across. I mean, as I said, our actual field-based research is effectively stalled, and we're relying on kind of conversations to feed things in. But just as a general answer to that, you know, it is obviously incredibly important. The evidence is unequivocal that mental health is a major issue in this pandemic. And I would also say that the inequalities in terms of how that's going to play out are going to be really, really, really severe. If you think about people who are living in incredibly close proximity to each other in non-formal settlements, you know, the difference in the pressures on them compared to people who are living in extreme isolation in gated communities, you know, and I think, you know, how sensitive programming is to those very different needs and those inequalities. You know, I think we don't know enough. I think that's a massive research agenda going forward.
Thanks, Michele. And to a certain extent, I think you've answered a related question that was posed by our colleague, Shrabani Maitra, who was speaking about the social justice focus of the projects that we're involved in and the key issue of impact. And again, she was asking if researchers could share experiences of the impact of the pandemic on their research. I don't think we can answer the specific question just at the moment of challenges or alternative ways of doing impact just at this moment, but that's a really good question to have posed, Shrabani. We touched upon the question that Mark Langdon had posed previously, which was to what extent has responding to the climate emergency impacted on thinking about research, policy and practice. And a subsidiary question, are people aware of the Teach for Future initiative? Again, we won't have time to deal with that in any depth, but I wonder if I can ask Shilpi just to say something about the issue of the climate emergency, and maybe Charles to add something, because in different ways in your countries, not to say that we're not suffering from the effects of climate change as well, but the issues that are posed in terms of flooding in Bangladesh, of an opposite phenomenon, not quite opposite, but the phenomenon of you know, arid conditions that very often take place, and migration issues that relate to that. How much is that impact?
Yes.
Shilpi, first of all.
Sorry, among two of our case study cities, Khulna is actually a coastal city, and due to climate change, the coastal belts are the hardest hit. So we get a large number of climate refugees in Khulna, and also climate migrants to Dhaka. And these people, they actually end up living in slums and squatters because they have really poor social capital and financial capital as well. They have low literacy rate. Usually those people end up in villages, but usually in villages, high income people are educated and they don't stay in villages. So for example, in many of our relatives, they have houses in villages, but they don't live in villages. So due to the heat of a cyclone, predominantly cyclone and flood, people lose their homestays, even they're rich. And afterwards, they need to actually come to the city for livelihood opportunities. So these people, when end up in living in slums there are opportunities in terms of education, and they had to actually focus more on earning opportunities. They don't want to send their kids to the schools, and NGOs are working really hard in large slums, but they are struggling because they fail to keep students. Poor people, they send their kids even for work. They are 6, 7 years old. So, so they are really struggling to come out from poverty. They can't actually access education because there are not many suitable opportunities for them, and they can't live without money. And that is affecting their performance in some way, and that is affecting their income status as well.
Thank you, Shilpi. Very quickly, can I hand over to Charles for one final thought around this issue of climate?
Thank you very much. This is, I think, one of the challenges we are facing, especially on the eastern part of Zimbabwe, where we border with Mozambique because of their proximity to the sea. And that the source is currently coming from that part of the world, where through Madagascar, currently we are actually right now worried if one of the tropical cyclones might develop into a cyclone and come into Zimbabwe. The last one, which occurred a few years ago, had devastating effects, which flattened, whole areas, wiped out schools, communities. Now, what it means to education is really bad, because you can make makeshift houses and so forth, but to restructure learning facilities is a big challenge. And right now, we used to have them very infrequently, but in the current years, they seem to be coming in very frequently. Just before Christmas, the people were moved from some villages and taken to higher places in schools, in churches, anticipating a cyclone that was impending. Lucky enough, it dissipated and we just have heavy rains, but not much of that. Now, currently, we don't know if this one develops into a cyclone, but it's really unsettling. And for planning purposes, you don't know what to do, because either you move the whole communities in the whole area to another location completely, and that's very complex. Or you keep on saying if there's a pending cyclone, you shift them temporarily and then bring them back. So it's really bad. I want to just say a short comment on the COVID, if you allow, where the impact of COVID on a research we're doing currently, where it seems to be impacting on the violence against children. And so when they are in the home with their parents and so forth, there seems to be more violence taking place. And we're currently carrying out a survey in conjunction with the Childline, where they collect data that, to see the reported cases of violence in the homes. And again, as it was indicated earlier, it's a whole area of new research of the whole impact of COVID on the health and mental health of children and parents themselves, but that violence seems to be coming from unstable adults and siblings. And although you are locked up within, but within becomes a dangerous place to live. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Charles, for those thoughts. We have one or two other questions, but we really have run out of time. So it only remains for me to, first of all, thank everyone who's taken part before I hand over to Marjorie for some final words. So thank you to Michele, to Muir for his presentation, but also for the excellent behind the scenes organization which he's been doing together with Sergio. And as I often say at these webinars, I don't think people realize quite often how much effort has to be put in the background to get these things to run smoothly. And so then also thank you to Alison and also to Sarah, who joined us for a short time, to Phil and Catherine, and to our two excellent presenters from our partners in the Global South, to Shilpi and to Charles for making such great interventions today. So thanks to all of you, and we're only 2 minutes over, and I'm going to hand over to Marjorie for just some final thoughts, and also to say to you that this is one of a series of 5 webinars, and we hope that you'll come to the next one, and we will be sending out further details about that shortly. Marjorie.
Great, thanks, Mike, and thank you again to our panelists and for your wonderful contributions. I leave with lots of questions, but quite enthused by the issues that you've raised, and I know that social justice and education is the connecting theme, and each of the subsequent webinars that we will have will address many of the aspects that you've looked at today. But I was struck by some of the points that our panelists have made, starting with Michele talking about neighbourhood and defining neighbourhood and neighbourhood of the mind, and then how that then reaches to the system and how we make the changes, and I was struck by the comments about the impact on the policymakers, and I do think there's a connectedness in all of this, and it's a connectedness, I think was it Phil made the point as well about the purposes of schooling and further and higher education as whether or not we're fulfilling our purpose, and I think COVID has really given us some challenges as well in terms of universities and the way that we engage. And interesting to hear from Alison around just how the children's neighbourhood, the model is very much led from a university, but it is about collaboration and partnership. And so in that spirit of collaboration and partnership, I do want to say a big thank you to everybody who's joined us as a participant today and really engaged in the discussion and asked really powerful questions. We are part of that global community, and the questions and the challenges that we will have in the next few years will require us all to work together and ask questions of each other, and I think we've made a great start to doing that today. So thank you to everybody, and thank you to our panelists again, and particularly to Mike and to Muir and those who've been putting everything together behind the scenes. So thank you very much, everybody, and hope to see you again on the 3rd of February.
Thanks, Marjorie. And so that formally brings an end to proceedings today, and goodbye to all of you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.